Welcome to the fourth episode of The Breakout. I'm your host, Abhi Gupta, and this is my co-host, Leo Xia. In today's episode, we're covering one topic, but this topic is mammoth, and it rocked a whole dynasty league. Yes, folks, today we're going to be talking about the mammoth 3-team trade that went down in the middle of the fantasy season. Leo, why don't you get us started on whatever this mammoth beast of a trade is?
This is crazy. So we'll put this on the screen. There's 3 different teams all receiving huge assets. So I think the best way to break this down is to talk about each trade individually by team to see if they won the trade or they lost the trade. And Abhi and I are going to be like your professors, and we're going to assign grades to each individual trade. So let's hop into this first team, the team that received Saquon Barkley and traded away Kyle Allen, Drew Lock, and James Robinson. My grade for this is an A. So my reasoning is, okay, you're trading away 3 different players, one quarterback, Drew Lock, who actually may have some potential, but what you're trying to do here is you're trying to consolidate your points and talent. You can only start so many guys on your team, on a starting roster. And depth is important, but you want guys that have this high ceiling, high floor each week. The players that we think are really elite. So if you're trading for guys to win, don't trade for the middling guys, right? Don't trade for the top 12 to top 24. Trade for the guys that will be like your top 5. And or the guys that you think can make that jump, and shell out a little bit more money to get those guys. It seems like there's a consensus, or there's a debate in the dynasty community about James Robinson. James Robinson had this really explosive rookie year, an undrafted free agent to Jacksonville, and he just kind of exploded out onto the scene. Some people are saying that he should be the guy taken over Clyde Edwards-Helaire in rookie drafts if we were to do a redraft. But looking at past data, since 2010, these are the undrafted free agent running backs that have recorded one top 12 season. Joique Bell, LeGarrette Blount, Chris Ivory, Austin Ekeler. Now, Austin Ekeler is one of the only ones that's probably seeing continued success. The other guys were all guys that you kind of didn't really want to own on your dynasty teams at the times. My point here is James Robinson had a really great first year, but it seems like what history is telling us is that undrafted free agent running backs usually aren't successful. My third reasoning for why this trade is an A is that this trade helps you get rid of players that won't help your team. So Kyle Allen is kind of a roster clogger. He filled in this year for Washington while Alex Smith was hurt and Dwayne Haskins was at strip clubs. And so he's not really a quarterback that's going to be helping you in the future. So, move him off while you can, get him off your team. You don't want to drop the guy, but you don't want to hold on to him either. The second player is Drew Lock. My thought is Drew Lock going to be the quarterback that pushes you over the edge? I know quarterbacks in Superflex leagues are pretty valuable, but is he the one that's going to push you over the edge? And I know that some people say that Drew Lock is still young. He has potential in his career. And we saw similar success for Josh Allen from year 2 to year 3 in 2019. So let's just say I'm a little bearish on Drew Lock. When we look at Josh Allen's stats from 2019, his second year, he had a 58.8% completion rating, 20 passing touchdowns to 9 interceptions, which is huge when we look at fantasy stats, an 85.3 QBR and 9 rushing touchdowns. When we look at Drew Lock, this year he had 16 passing touchdowns, 3 rushing, and 15 interceptions. Not very good. So already we see that Josh Allen, even though he had a kind of a meh year 2, was still pretty good. He was still putting up top 12 numbers in certain weeks. So Drew Lock, does he have room to improve? Can he improve? Definitely. But are we expecting him to be Josh Allen? I would say Josh Allen is the outlier here. And the third player on this is James Robinson. Obviously, we just talked about how undrafted free agent running backs historically have not been great. Can James Robinson be great? Sure, he could be. He could be the one outlier that proves all of us wrong. But I think you're going out there and trading away question marks for a sure thing like Saquon Barkley.
I think those are all reasonable points, Leo. But I'm about to say something that Stephen A. say would be ASA 9, ASA 10, ASA 11. I'm not a huge fan of Saquon, and I never have been. A lot of people are going to say, Abhi, what the hell are you talking about? Saquon was a top 4 dynasty pick this season, last season, 3 seasons ago. How could you say that Saquon is a player that you don't like? Well, I'll just tell you, based on the way that I watch games, the way that I watch film, I get a sense of players. And with Saquon, I'm not denying that he's great. I'm not denying that he's generational. But when it comes to my fantasy team, when it comes to the way that I like to feel each weekend with my players on my fantasy teams, he's too boom bust for me. If you look at many of his games, Saquon in, let's say, 20 rushes, has 17 to 18 rushes that are sub 2 yards. And the plays where he will generate his points are on those highlight 60, 70 yard touchdown runs, right? He's got these big explosive getaway plays. But as a runner, the fundamental production that you produce is in those general average runs. Those breakaway runs are great, and they will be the things that the fans remember, but you cannot rely on that as your means of production. And so I went ahead and crunched the numbers on Saquon and compared him to the top 12 running backs from the past 2020 NFL season. Now, if you take a look at his positive run share, which is the percent of runs that Saquon had that resulted in positive yardage, he had 7% fewer positive run share than the average top 12 running back. But let's look into this a little bit deeper. His yards per attempt are 0.2 higher than the average running back in the top 12. But if you take a look at the non-outlier runs, as in all of the runs that are within 10 yards, non-explosive plays that you normally see in these highlight plays, Saquon has a ridiculously low 10 minus yards per attempt. And what this signals to us is that Saquon is a boom-bust running back. If you take a look at all of the other running backs that are in the top 12, no one is even close to Saquon's number. Saquon falls way below the top 12 running back. But let's take a look one step further. If you take a look at the 10 minus touchdown rate, that is the number of touchdowns that Saquon scores on rushes less than 10 yards. He falls drastically below the rest of the top 12 running backs at 47%. If you take a look at everybody else, they are at minimum 58% of the time scoring their touchdowns within 10 yards, with the average being 72%. Saquon is a boom-bust running back, and for me, I don't want to touch him. Now again, for all of you looking at the numbers, you're saying, Abhi, you hate Saquon, that's the stupidest take that I've ever heard. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that for my taste, I like running backs who produce consistently. I will always take the running back that has 5 to 6 yards per rush. Well, I mean, anybody would, right? But on average produces these runs carry over carry instead of 10 1-yard rushes and 5 explosive runs, because the explosive runs are the ones that are not sustainable. You add in the fact that Saquon is now coming off an ACL injury. I don't want to touch that. Furthermore, you compare Saquon to James Robinson, and James Robinson is taking over and producing on a team that is bad and is producing at this clip. What happens now when you have a QB in the game? Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, right? You don't expect James Robinson to be the only effective weapon. This guy is going to be utilized better. He's going to be utilized more. And I frankly don't trust what the Giants are doing with Daniel Jones. I don't trust what they're doing with their offense. And there's a lot of flux there. So if you look at this trade of Saquon for Kyle Allen, Drew Lock, James Robinson, I'm saying forget Kyle Allen, he's froth. Maybe even forget Drew Lock, right? We don't know if he's going to be starting next year. If I'm looking at this from a standpoint of Saquon for James Robinson, I would say that on average, they are about equivalent. Forget draft capital, all of that sort of stuff. As players, I think that Saquon and James Robinson are pretty equivalent players. Now, when you take a look at the trade that's happening here, Pandoj, the person who made this trade, his team is a win later team. So from his perspective, he's like, look, I'm trying to cash my chips out, right? And as you've pointed out, Leo, with the undrafted free agents are generally let go very, very quickly once you find someone who has more organizational clout, i.e. draft capital. And by nature of the fact that Saquon was drafted in the top 5 and James Robinson wasn't drafted, I know that as an asset, Saquon Barkley is going to last longer than James Robinson. But strictly from the perspective of Saquon versus James Robinson and then all the extra stuff that I had to give up, I don't think I would have made this move. But hey, props to you for pulling the trigger.
No, Abhi, what you're saying is a little bit outrageous, right? But it's not completely unfounded. You're not saying that Saquon Barkley is bad, right? You're not saying he's a bad running back, but you're saying that from a fantasy standpoint, he's kind of like Mike Evans. And I think any Mike Evans owners will express their frustration with him. One week he goes off for 40 points, and the next week he puts up a dud, right? So based on your data, it seems like Saquon has those similar qualities where he's not that every down consistent player, but there are certain games where he'll get you a ton of points.
Mm-hmm. And it's all about how you want to construct your roster. But at the end of the day, I give this trade a B-. I wouldn't have made the move.
Let's jump into the second leg of this trade here. And this is probably the craziest trade that I've ever seen because this team, Teeny Tiny Titan, traded away Julio Jones, Jamison Crowder, Austin Ekeler, and Saquon Barkley for this other guy's picks for the next 3 years. He has all his firsts, all his seconds, and all of his thirds. This is wild. I've never seen a guy trade away all of his picks for the next 3 years.
Big baller moves only, right? No risk it, no biscuit.
I guess so.
You can't fault anybody in this trade for being bold. You know, they're trying to do what's best for their own teams. I just think that there are some clear winners and losers here.
That's right. If you hit, you're gonna hit. If you miss, oh boy, you're sending your team back. It's a massive, massive miss.
Yep.
Jumping into my analysis of this, I'm gonna give this one a C+. And so I'm gonna explain why. I think this trade is actually decent value if you believe in your drafting skills. And you're giving away some surefire assets like Julio Jones, Jamison Crowder. He's not a guy that'll put you over the edge, but he can definitely help you win a championship. Austin Ekeler. Also, I'm not super high on undrafted free agent running backs, but he has shown success in the past couple of years. And Saquon Barkley, pretty much the premier running back dynasty talent. Getting all of these picks is probably equivalent in value in a vacuum, right? If we look at it, he received 3 first-round picks. Yeah, roughly probably what you would get. But the problem for me is that the picks span 3 years. Like you don't know how good the team that traded you the picks will be in 2 to 3 years. You just don't know. And when you have picks, first round picks that are so far into the future, let's say you're rebuilding. When they're so far into the future, it's hard to time your window perfectly. Like you're essentially assuming that you're going to be rebuilding for the next 2 to 3 years. Mm-hmm. And so that's a strategy that I just don't agree with. I think in Dynasty, in the past, rebuilds might have taken 3+ years, but in the present day, you can win a championship and rebuild your team within 1 to 2 years. So I think the time window is too large for me.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. You know, Leo, a lot of this comes down to your own factors and your own risk tolerance, your levels of patience, and your trust in your own, drafting skills, your own analysis, etc. I think that this trade, you can view it, and you should view it, in two different lenses. There's first the lens of just the straight up value for the assets that are in this transaction. And then there's the context given the guy who is acquiring all of these picks. So let's look at it first from the standpoint of, okay, I am trading away Julio, Ekeler, and Saquon for 3 firsts, 3 seconds, 3 thirds. Okay, let's say at best case, you can add up all of the seconds and all of the thirds, and maybe it's equivalent to like 1.5 late firsts. So we can group all those picks and say, best case expected value, all of those picks are equivalent to 4.5 firsts. Okay, what would you get for each of those assets? Well, I would say that Saquon's probably worth 2 to 3 firsts, right? Based on, not just his age, but also his level of quote unquote efficiency. Julio is worth a late first to an early second still. Jamison, Crowder, froth, forget about that. And Austin Eckler's probably worth a late first. So that is a range of value somewhere between 4 and 5 firsts. And what Teeny did here was he got rid of a bunch of players in order to build up his window, right? And to give you context on his team, he's torn down his team almost completely and tried to get as many picks as he can. I believe he owns 1/3 of this league's first and second round picks for the 2021 draft, and that's this guy's strategy. But I don't think that value was killer. I think that this value was fine, and in that vein, I give this trade a B. But I think given the context of, what Teeny has done in regards to rebuilding, you have to understand that nobody is giving you 4.5 firsts for Julio and Ekeler and something else unless you attach Saquon to it. And from that perspective, Saquon is what is allowing you to not just get rid of him, but a bunch of other assets that you don't want on your team. And so in a way, what he's doing is he's saying, I'm cashing out Julio and Ekeler and Crowder all at the same time and trying to get some sort of fixed value for it. Fix in the terms of draft capital. And in that vein, I don't knock him for it. But given, the fact that you got fine value and you're just trying to cash out, I would give this trade a B. And this brings us to the third leg of this very, very long international flight that we call this 3-team trade. And this is the one where we really evaluate whether trading away all of your picks is worth it in order to maximize your window. So let's put this one up on the screen. This player is the one who traded away all of his picks for the next 3 years, rounds 1 through 3, in order to acquire Julio, Jamison Crowder, Ekeler, Kyle Allen, Drew Lock, and James Robinson. Leo, I think you and I had one single thought with this trade, and that was,
what the fuck are you doing, man?
Like, oh my god, like this I needed a week to just figure out how I felt about this, because it's like you've never seen someone do something so aggressive and so, bold, that it's like the only reaction is what the fuck. Leo, what were your thoughts on this trade?
I mean, honestly, prop to the Goonies for having the balls to pull something like this off. This is something that I probably would have never done, and will probably still never do, unless like the offer is just outrageous. And even then, I value picks pretty highly. Like I just like picking players in the rookie drafts, and so I think it's an incredibly risky move because you don't have any picks for the next 3 years. That doesn't mean that you can't offload some of those players and get value in the future, but it means you have to put in the work to do that, right? Let's say that you have no picks for the next 3 years. If you whiff on these players and they don't get you a championship, you're setting yourself up for failure for 3+ years, because these players are going to depreciate in value, right? You have Julio Jones, who's 31. You have Austin Ekeler, who is an undrafted free agent. I miss Jamison Crowder, but he's just kind of like adding into the mix. Kyle Allen is probably going to end up as a backup quarterback. Drew Lock, we already talked about. He has potential in the league, but he hasn't shown it like another guy, Josh Allen, has. And
he just dances too much.
Yeah. And we have James Robinson, another undrafted free agent running backs. And you know how I feel about undrafted free agent running backs. So you're adding a lot of question marks to your team that could potentially only go down in value. You're not chasing after those young players that you think could potentially reach that top 5 range. You're going after players that have already reached that top 5 range. I'm basically what this looks like to me is you're saying, okay, I'm going all in, but you're not buying all in players, you know? You don't need to add more of those question marks to your team. You need to be ponying up the draft capital to add those top 5 players like AJ Brown, Justin Jefferson. Just you pay a little bit more money if you're going to like try to go all in, you know? Another strategy to this is if you want to go all in, you can pursue cheap veterans. So in the past year, players like Cole Beasley probably got you points during the year. Pursuing these cheap veterans is another easy way to add depth to your team, but it might not take you over the top. That's why I'm giving this trade a D.
Yeah, and you know, with this being the last leg, I think we agree. I also give this trade a D. And I'm sorry, Goonies. You know, I think that what you have right now is a strategy that you tried to execute on. And I don't disagree with the strategy. You know, if you don't think that you're great at drafting, if you're not a gambler, and you say, hey, these picks are risk value, I want to cash out the risk for certainty, then this is a great strategy for not only your team, but for your own sanity, which is more important. But it's important to also recognize that sometimes this doesn't pan out. And when you give up your future, you need to make sure that you're getting something that lasts out of it. If I'm going to give you 3 years worth of picks, I need to not just get good players, but I need to get players who will carry me through a 3-year window minimum. Because if I don't succeed, if this doesn't pan out, I have no other out but to live in the bowels of my league for the duration of time, you know, or I have to figure out who can buy my assets for pennies on the dollar. I mean, as you pointed out, Leo, Julio's 31 and injured, Ekeler's 25, and for a running back, that's scary because he's entering a contract year with the Chargers, who just didn't sign Melvin Gordon, and they drafted him high. So he's probably not going to get re-signed. He's going to bounce around. And then James Robinson is a great asset, but again, undrafted free agent. You have no assurances with that player. You take in those QBs who are iffy, and what is your sure value here? You didn't get Saquon, even though Tiny Titan gave up Saquon. You didn't get him. No, you got James Robinson, who is great. You got Drew Lock, who at midseason potentially could be someone. And you got Ekeler, who you're like, he's hurt, but once he's playing, he's great. But you didn't get anyone who you can use as a cornerstone piece for your franchise moving forward. And so where is your guaranteed value? I don't see any in this trade, and because of that, I'm going to give it a D. Wouldn't have made this trade.
Yeah, Abhi, I think a little bit of hindsight bias. But did this team win the championship this year?
No. So this team didn't actually make the playoffs. And I will say that this team had several losses that were like really ridiculous. You know, Gronk needed to make 2 catches for him to, win the game, and Gronk caught one ball. Very iffy things like that. His team is very good, and next year I think he still has a window, but he finished 6th, so he didn't even end up in the playoffs.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a little bit of hindsight bias that we're saying, okay, obviously this trade didn't work out because he didn't make the playoffs. He does have a chance next year, but I think our analysis of this is when you make this trade, as is, the likelihood that you make the playoffs or win a championship are lower than if you don't make this trade.
In essence, when you make the trade, you need to capitalize. Otherwise, good luck rebuilding. So, Leo, my final question to you here is, who came out the best out of these 3 teams, in your opinion?
I know you just went on a long rant about why Saquon is bad for your fantasy team, but I'm going to go Pandoge with the Saquon Barkley. He didn't have to risk that much, and his return was a pretty decent player. I mean, arguably the best running back in the NFL.
Okay. I would have to say that I like Teeny's strategy given his team context. I don't think he had to give up all too much in order to get a lot of pieces. And for a team who completely tore down his roster, I think that he's the one who got the closest to what he is trying to do in terms of his team building philosophy, which is to trade everybody and get as many picks as you can. So, Leo, in conclusion, who do you think won this trade? And by one, I mean, who got closest to, what they're trying to do with their team?
I'm going to say Pandoge here, even though you went on that long explanation of why Saquon Barkley should not be on your fantasy football team. I'm going to still go Pandoge. I think Saquon Barkley is arguably the best running back in the NFL when healthy. ACL injuries are not as scary as they used to be. And when you have a player like Saquon that can deliver you points week in, week out, you have a pretty successful team you can build around.
I think that's pretty fair. I'd have to say that I think that Teeny Tiny Titan was the one who came out the best from this trade. I think that his team philosophy is trade away everyone and get all the picks. And if you're gonna buy into a philosophy, don't go half-hearted. I would say that his philosophy is I'm gonna draft 2021 onwards into a championship, and considering what he had to give up, I think that he came out the best out of all the teams. So we hope that with today's episode, you learned something a little bit new about how to value players, about how to look at trades, and about how to lean into whatever team philosophy, team building philosophy that aligns most with you. A lot of these teams did that, and perhaps it gives you maybe some ideas about trades that you want to make moving forward as well. This has been another episode of The Breakout. I'm your host, Abhi, and this is my co-host, Leo. Let's hit the music.